I left Congress at the end of 2010 to change and hopefully to change my life. Since then, I had been crisscrossing the country on a sort of Lewis and Clark expedition into new frontiers of medicine, politics, economics, and human emotion and mental health care and brain research. I speak to groups who want to hear about my personal challenges and my political challenges and about the future of healthcare, especially healthcare from the neck up. I meet with top scientists with top scientists in their labs and see the cutting edge of research. I hold public hearings for patients and families denied their mental health benefits. And I'm constantly pulled aside for private and incredibly revealing conversations with an amazing broad cross-section of people. They often just need someone to talk to about their own challenging experiences with brain diseases, someone who gets it. But they also appreciate having that conversation with someone who is deeply involved in the worlds of mental health policy, medicine, science, law, and economics. So when they ask what they can do to help or what the future looks like, they can get a useful answer or at least an informed opinion on what isn't yet known. For the past 20 years, including my time in the House, I had been immersed in the big science and big business of mental health, as well as the small steps of progress in many people's care. I interact with everyone from heads to the state and international business, leading who privately suffer with mental illness to the local family we know, whose mentally ill son was shot to death by an untrained police officer. I also get deeply involved in the politics of the brain, which are fascinating and inspiring, but also sometimes bruising. The fight to save beautiful minds can get pretty ugly. I've had a chance to see these frictions from a unique perspective while sitting on a House committee, while asked to fund all these competing approaches and perspectives. I was also suffering from and not always taking very good care of the mental illnesses or bipolar and anxiety disorders and the substance use disorders of binge drinking and opiates abuse. I've watched debates by top scientists, policy analysts, treatment professionals, drug manufacturers, and insurers, and then just weeks later sat in group therapy commiserated with fellow impatients about the same problems from a wholly different vantage point. It takes a while to understand and navigate these worlds as a patient or a family member, and a shocking number of people walk away from treatment that works after reading something inflammatory about the politics and economics of care. Or they game the failures of integration in the system, hide between the cracks, and make themselves sicker. I have in my career as a patient seen and done both. But working in the politics of medicine, I also understand that everyone in the world of brain diseases has attitudes formed in an environment of discrimination and prejudice. Most of the varied approaches to care began getting traction before there were actually any medicines that worked, and the business of those medicines now often competes with the businesses of behavioral therapies and supports, as well as the housing and employment assistance usually required to keep people in any kind of treatment and healthy lifestyle. Each sector treating mental illness or addiction is challenged, underfunded, and discriminated against its own way. But it's still hard to watch people who care deeply about brain diseases have devoted their lives to their treatment, competing on medical, legal, or financial issues. And if it's certain diagnoses or therapeutic approaches are supposed to win, it is sometimes hard to remind all these people, who, by the way, work incredibly hard in their own worlds, that they are all treating the same organ, the brain. And just like for every other organ, we need to support research and reimburse a menu of evidence-based approaches. We need to build bridges between all the disparate researchers and clinicians in neurology, psychiatry, psychology, developmental disabilities and cognitive impairments, as well as the people they treat and their families. We need to help inspire an increasingly one-minded approach to not only mental illness and addiction, but brain diseases up from autism to Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder to traumatic brain injury, seizures to PTSD. We need to constantly remind people that this is a common struggle. People have been lamenting the stigma of mental illness and addiction for centuries, so why do I think anything is going to change now? Simple. Until very recently, it was completely illegal to discriminate in the treatment and insurance coverage against those with mental illness and addiction. We have referred to the phenomenon as stigma, as if there was some justification and shared responsibility for the questioning and blaming and undermining of those with certain types of illnesses, describing their traumas as challenges as little fender benders. But it's time to stop asking to be destigmatized and instead start demanding an end to discrimination. Because what many still don't realize is that this discrimination is now a federal crime. Mental health parity is finally the law of the land based on the guarantees of Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which my father and I helped pass together in 2008 but had only recently started being implemented, and the Obama Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. It is finally illegal to cover mental illness, addiction, and intellectual disabilities any differently than other medical conditions, and pre-existing conditions can never be used to restrict access to coverage. While these laws were signed several years ago because of court challenges and the seemingly endless process of government rulemaking, they couldn't be fully enforced until July 1, 2014. And they were barely being enforced today. The Mental Health Parity Act is the equivalent of the Medical Civil Rights Act, a brain disease equal rights amendment. The legal end of the discrimination that is at the heart of the stigma of brain diseases. As a politician, as a patient, and as a member of a family haunted by mental illness and addiction, I have waited my entire life for this moment. But I also know that since we weren't sure this moment would ever come, we are largely unprepared for it. We are still struggling to figure out how the promise of mental health parity will be put into practice. 50 years ago, when civil rights became the law of the land, nobody was really sure how to outlaw racial discrimination. It was up to people like my Uncle Bobby as Attorney General and later as Senator, along as many other figures, out how to operationalize and enforce such a societal change. And we will have to figure out how to do the same for this parity by outlawing medical discrimination, stigma, and inadequate care. It's a daunting, exciting challenge. We have all lived our entire lives, as did our parents, our doctors, and our leaders, making decisions about mental illness and addiction under the assumption that there would be prejudice. There would always be institutionalized legal stigma and discrimination. We have to start adjusting to the unfolding realities of a post-parity world and help change that world. We must do it now, together and in the open. Our secrets are our most formidable adversaries. Our most formidable adversaries. The older I get, the more I get secrecy as the enemy within, which blocks recovery not only for individuals but for society itself. That phrase has a special meaning to me. Not long before he died, my father gave me his copy of his brother Bobby's 1960 book about union corruption. The Enemy Within. It is autographed to Teddy, who has his own enemy within. Giving me that book was the closest thing my father ever came to acknowledging anything to me about his own struggles, which is probably why I have been so invested in exposing the secrecy around mental illness. Since I first came out about my treatment for bipolar and addiction, I have found myself taking incredibly frankly to an enormous number of people who feel it isn't safe to share the secrets of their illnesses. I've had these intimate and moving conversations with an astonishing number of people, from the powerful to those who feel utterly powerless. Sometimes the conversations become a huge step in their ability to acknowledge the common struggle. Other times they reinforce the hypocrisy and pain of our stigmatizing society. You would not believe how many times a congressman or other public official has pulled me aside for advice and counseling because they have or a loved one suffered from a mood disorder or an addiction and need a recommendation for treatment. And I still had a hard time believing how many of these same public officials have failed to support funding for mental illness or addiction research and even voted against parity for their treatment. Recently, I found myself being more open in my advocacy, perhaps because the national tragedies involving mental illness have made the cost of remaining quiet more clear. I've been also reaching out to the doctors who treated me over the years to discuss my own care and the state of mental health care. Their conversations have been fascinating, especially now that I've had this perspective of today's science and my own personal perspective from the longest period of continuous sobriety I've experienced since the age of 13. That sobriety has not been very long, and I don't kid myself that it will ever get any easier to maintain. I began counting it several months after my last days in Congress on February 22, 2011, what would have been my father's 79th birthday. And the main reason I was able to stay sober is because of a stroke of luck and coincidence that I am more than happy to attribute to divine intervention. The spring before I left Congress, I met and fell in love with my wife, Amy, a middle school teacher in coastal South Jersey, where I now live. Amy has saved my life in so many ways, but more important, has provided the love and support I needed to commit to the daily work and joy of saving my own life. Amy and our young children are what keeps me on my spiritual journey of recovery and hope. In fact, they are probably the only reason I'm still alive. They remind me every day of our most underappreciated treatments for these illnesses, love and faith. They also remind me of the biggest reason to fight for mental health parity. My own children are at a considerable genetic risk, as I was, of developing mental illness and addiction, which means that they can and must be part of the first generation in American history to have their brain diseases treated like every other disease. Our children must be part of the first generation of which routine doctor visits include a checkup from the neck up. When you have heart disease or cancer, nobody questions your diagnosis, even if it changes or your treatment changes direction, and nobody uses setbacks in treatment as an excuse to question whether or not cancer or heart disease really exists, or if they are all in your head. My goal is to change the way we talk about mental illnesses and addiction in this country. Move the conversation from a painful existential debate to a more useful and forward-looking discussion about proper diagnosis and care. The sad truth is that while we still have so much to learn about the brain, most patients don't even benefit from what we already know. More than half the people who had been diagnosed with any mental illness do not get treatment at all. It's time for this to change. My hope is that by writing about the exposing worlds I get to visit as a politician, advocate, patient, and family member, I might be able to make your journey less isolated. These struggles are much more common than most people realize, but too many of us still face them alone, if we face them at all. That isn't necessary, it isn't healthy, and it isn't how any of us want to live our lives. I believe more than ever that we have made the power to help change the world for people who have mental illnesses and addiction, and for all of those whose lives are touched by these brain diseases, which is to say, all of us. In fact, I have bet my life on it.